A violent incident unfolded recently in the occupied West Bank, which has seen an onslaught of violence and land grabs by extremist settlers enabled by the IDF as well as IDF raids. 2 Palestinians rammed into Israeli border police. Those police then fired on the assailants, and in the chaos, a stray bullet fired by the Israelis killed a 3-year-old Bedouin Palestinian child. Take a listen, though, to how Sky News described these events.
This happened at the border checkpoint. You can see a car going through and ramming some of the police that were actually manning that checkpoint. The video we're going to freeze shortly, but the 2 people, there's a man and a woman in the car. Subsequently, they were killed by the police, but it looks like accidentally a stray bullet found its way into the van ahead, and that killed a 3 or 4-year-old young lady. So tragic events in the West Bank.
That's right. A 3-year-old was described as a, quote, young lady. The bullet, of course, just magically found its way into the vehicle. Now, contrast this language to a recent report in the Daily Mail decrying the continued captivity of 4 Israeli women still being held by Hamas. Their headline reads, "The faces of the girls still being held by Hamas as their families make a desperate plea for their release 3 months after they were captured." The article features deeply emotional interviews with the families of these women who I am sure are absolutely tormented. But these are not, in fact, girls. They are adult women, old enough to serve in the IDF, which all 4 of them do. A fact that was conveniently left out of that entire Daily Mail piece. So you're left with the specter of a literal toddler being called a young lady, while adult women soldiers are called girls. And while these soldiers, combatants in an ongoing war, are portrayed in the fullness of their humanity with their hopes, their wishes, the terror of their families all showcased, we will never know anything more than the most basic of details about the 3-year-old. What was her favorite toy? Does she have a big brother who misses her? Will her parents ever be able to get over the loss of their darling girl? Now, you might think I'm cherry picking here, one-off incidents of shoddy and one-sided journalism, but a growing mountain of evidence shows that the dehumanization of Palestinians and egregiously lopsided coverage is systematic and it is widespread. In fact, according to a new analysis, the unprecedented toll that Israel's assault on Gaza has taken on children has been rendered nearly invisible, featured in just 2 headlines out of 1,100 that were examined by The Intercept. But that is far from all. Wild imbalances are happening at CNN, where we now know they willingly operate under the IDF censorship regime, but also at prestige papers like the Washington Post, which positions itself as a beacon of journalistic courage and integrity, at right-wing outlets like Fox News, and also at liberal ones like MSNBC. Right here in the US, that imbalance is manifest, but also in Britain at the BBC. Even for someone as jaded and skeptical of mainstream coverage as I certainly am, the insanely imbalanced nature of these numbers is still shocking. So let's start with the new report. This was published in The Intercept, compiled by Adam Johnson and Othman Ali. They took a look at coverage in 3 ostensibly liberal outlets: The Times, The Washington Post, and the LA Times over a 6-week period from October 7th through November 24th. And they compiled a number of metrics seeking to show the consistent way that Israeli lives are valued to a dramatically greater degree than Palestinian lives. Just take a look at this chart. So they calculated that the word slaughter was used to describe the killing of Israelis on October 7th 60 times. Yet when it came to Palestinians, many thousands more of whom have been killed, only a single time was their mass killing described as it should be, as a slaughter. It's a similar story with the word horrific. Hamas's actions were described as horrific 38 times. That's appropriate. Israeli assaults on innocent civilians were only described as horrific 4 times in 6 weeks. October 7th was labeled a massacre a full 120 times during the relevant period, but as Palestinians were being killed by the tens of thousands, these deaths were only described as a massacre 4 times. Now, keep in mind, according to Euromed Monitor, 28,201 Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israel since October 7th. An estimated 695 civilians were killed in the Hamas attack on October 7th. In other words, 40 times more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis. But if you were to judge the relative loss of life by the number of mentions in media outlets, you would have to presume far more dead Israelis than Palestinians by a long stretch. According to Adam and Ali's analysis, for every 2 Palestinian deaths, Palestinians are mentioned once. For every Israeli death, Israelis are mentioned 8 times, or a rate 16 times more per death than that of Palestinians. And you can see this from this chart. As more Palestinians were killed, they were actually mentioned less and less, We witnessed this in real time, how invented university anti-Semitism scandals and whatever the hell is going on with Bill Ackman, how that took the place of coverage of the increasingly undeniable horrors that Palestinians are being subjected to. This chart tracks how as the horror increased, the coverage actually decreased. Also revealed in this report, real and invented anti-Semitism was covered far more vigorously than Islamophobia. This in spite of the fact that multiple violent incidents during this time appeared spurred by anti-Muslim or anti-Arab hate. 87% of mentions of discrimination concerned anti-Semitism, only 13% concerned Islamophobia. The cable news landscape is, unsurprisingly, at least equally as grim. This chart from Adam's Substack, The Column, tracks how many times Israelis were described as having been massacred versus Palestinians over the first month of the conflict. Out of 1,733 massacre mentions, 1,655 came of them when describing Israelis killed on October 7th. This evocative language was only applied to Palestinian deaths 78 times. They further document in this piece that usually when massacre was actually used with regard to Palestinians, it didn't come directly from network anchors or commentators, but as comments attributed to Palestinians. So for example, Richard Engel of NBC News, he said that, quote, Palestinians call it a massacre, passive language that is debatable rather than unequivocal. Ali and Adam also reveal in this report that although children and journalists, sympathetic and protected groups have been slaughtered at rates far higher than any other modern conflict, they have received scant media coverage. This contrasts dramatically with the coverage of the Ukraine war, where the impact on children and on the press was a frequent subject of commentary and of reporting. Now, to be clear, 6 journalists were killed in the early days of the Ukraine war, and that is a terrible toll. 48 were killed in the first weeks of Israel's assault on Gaza. That number has now skyrocketed to over 110. These people have the nerve to posture as defenders of the free press. What utter and complete garbage. Finally, to show you, I guess, we're not alone in insufferable and completely dishonest coverage, British commentator Owen Jones recently featured analysis on BBC coverage conducted by Mona Chalabi with a lot of very similar results. Just take a listen to a portion of Owen's report.
As for emotive words, murder or murdered is used 101 times in reference to Israelis, compared to 1 time in reference to Palestinians. So he might go, well, look, come on, an airstrike killing lots of people is extremely horrific, but it's different to someone just going up to someone and shooting them. Well, look, if you take that approach, we'll have to beg to differ. There's ample evidence that Israel is deliberately killing civilians. I make no apology for saying that. The so-called Daher Doctrine, first developed in the 2006 Lebanon war to deliberately kill civilians to put pressure on civilian populations to achieve political goals, is clearly in action in Gaza. And indeed 972 magazine, using leaked information from Israeli military intelligence sources, makes it abundantly clear that Palestinian civilians are clearly being deliberately killed. In any case, what of the fact that several Palestinians have been objectively murdered in the West Bank alone in this time period, in ways extremely comparable actually to the way that many Israeli civilians were killed on the 7th of October. The West Bank, as you will know, is of course not run by Hamas. Now, as for other emotive words, well, massacre or massacred is used 23 times in reference to Israelis. It's used just once in relation to Gaza. That for me actually just sums up the whole problem with Western media coverage. Because if it actually reflected reality, we would be referring to what's happening to Gaza as one of the great massacres of our time. But in any case, clearly the BBC does not believe that, for example, wiping out entire bloodlines of Palestinians constitutes a massacre. As for slaughter or slaughtered, those words, that's used 20 times. 20 times in reference to Israelis. In reference to Palestinians, 0 times, not once.
So here's a visualization of what Owen was just discussing there that you can take a look at. And the bottom line is this: Israelis are murdered, Palestinians simply inexplicably die. Now, something that I've grappled with over these past several months that has really shaken me. How? How is the unrelenting assault allowed to persist? How is there not uniform condemnation of the killing of civilians, of their starvation, of their permanent destruction of their homes, schools, mosques, neighborhoods, and so much more? The massacre of children, journalists, aid workers, doctors. As fellow at the Institute for Global Affairs Asal Ral put it, I feel stupid for thinking that we believed as a society that killing thousands of children, burying them under rubble, and amputating their limbs without anesthesia is wrong no matter what. I naively thought that was one thing we could all agree on. Now, when the history is written, of how the West looked on with approval and rushed to supply the bombs that were dropped on the babies of Palestine. When that history is written, these charts will need to be shown. They must be shown. Because a vital part of that story is how the Western press did their absolute damnedest to hide from citizens the horrors that their own taxpayer dollars are paying for. For the real story, you will do a hell of a lot better joining the Zoomers over on TikTok. And Saagar, we actually...
Hey guys, if you want to see what I had to say to Krystal's monologue, not just this one, all of them, going back to the very beginning, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com.